The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. Part 1, The Spark in the Wilderness. Imagine the vast wilderness of North America in the mid-1700s. Endless forests stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. Rivers like silver veins cutting through untouched land. In this raw and wild continent, empires dreamed of power, and those dreams were about to clash. This is the story of the French and Indian War, a brutal, world-shaping conflict fought long before the American Revolution. It was the first great war fought on American soil, a struggle not only between France and Britain, but among native nations, settlers, and destiny itself. The war would begin in the deep woods of the Ohio River Valley, and end by redrawing the map of the world. By 1750, North America was divided between two mighty empires. To the east, the British colonies were thriving, 13 provinces hugging the Atlantic coast, filled with farms, towns, and nearly 2 million settlers. To the west, beyond the Appalachian Mountains, stretched New France, a vast, thinly populated territory ruled from Quebec and New Orleans, claimed by France but largely inhabited by indigenous peoples. Between these two worlds lay the Ohio River Valley, rich, fertile, and strategic. Whoever controlled it would control the gateway to the continent. The French saw it as the vital link between their northern and southern colonies. The British saw it as the key to expansion and trade. Native nations, including the Iroquois, Delaware, Shawnee, and Mingo, saw it as their homeland. For decades, fragile diplomacy had kept the peace. But as British settlers began pushing westward, the balance shattered. The French responded by building a chain of forts from Lake Erie down to the forks of the Ohio River, today's Pittsburgh. In 1753, the British governor of Virginia decided to act. He sent a young militia officer, George Washington, just 21 years old, to deliver a message to the French: "Leave this territory, it belongs to His Majesty the King of Great Britain." The French refused. It was late autumn when Washington and a small party of frontiersmen set out on their dangerous journey through snow-covered forests. They trekked hundreds of miles across mountains and rivers, delivering the governor's ultimatum to the French commander at Fort Le Boeuf. The French officer received the letter politely, and handed back a written response: they intended to stay. Washington returned to Virginia a minor hero. But the situation was now on the edge of war. In the spring of 1754, he was sent again, this time with orders to build a fort at the strategic confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. But before he could finish, French forces arrived first, drove the British away, and built Fort Duquesne in its place. Determined to strike back, Washington led a small group of colonial troops north through the wilderness. There, on May 28, 1754, they ambushed a French detachment in the woods. Shots were fired. A French officer, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, was killed. It was a small skirmish, but it was enough. Blood had been spilled. The French and Indian War had begun. After the ambush, Washington hastily built a crude circular fort in a muddy meadow. He called it Fort Necessity. The name proved prophetic. Within weeks, hundreds of French soldiers and their native allies surrounded it. Rain poured down. The trenches flooded. Washington's men were soaked, hungry, and exhausted. On July 3, 1754, the French attacked. Musket balls ripped through the wet air, splintering the fort's wooden palisades. After an all-day fight, Washington was forced to surrender. The next morning, he marched his defeated men back to Virginia, humiliated, but alive. He had signed, without realizing it, a document admitting to the assassination of Jumonville. It was the young officer's first taste of war, and his first bitter defeat. To Europe, this small frontier clash seemed insignificant. But in truth, it was the spark that would ignite a global conflict, one that would rage across continents and oceans. Within 2 years, the 7 Years' War would engulf the world, from India to the Caribbean to Europe itself. But here in America, it would always be remembered by another name, the French and Indian War. To the native peoples of North America, this war was not simply a battle between France and Britain. It was a struggle for survival. Many tribes had long allied with the French, who, unlike the British, traded furs, intermarried, and often respected native customs. The Algonquin, Huron, Ottawa, and Abenaki sided with France. The Iroquois Confederacy, long rivals of the Algonquin, leaned toward the British, though their loyalty was uncertain. The war turned native diplomacy into a deadly gamble. Tribes had to choose, not out of loyalty to kings across the sea, but to protect their own lands, trade, and people. For every alliance, there was betrayal. For every promise, a broken treaty. In the forests of the frontier, native warriors became the masters of ambush and surprise. They guided French troops through hidden paths, struck isolated British settlements, and vanished into the trees. To many British colonists, this guerrilla warfare was terrifying. To native nations, it was survival, a fight for balance in a world being carved apart by empires. News of Washington's defeat sent shockwaves through the colonies. In London, Prime Minister William Pitt and the British government realized that France's presence in North America was more dangerous than ever. The British Crown decided to send regular troops, professional soldiers, to the colonies. But at first, these professional soldiers underestimated the land and its people. In 1755, General Edward Braddock, a proud and experienced British officer, led a massive expedition to capture Fort Duquesne. He marched through the Pennsylvania wilderness with nearly 2,000 redcoats, drums beating, banners flying, a grand display of European discipline. Among his aides was none other than George Washington, who warned Braddock that the French and their native allies would not fight like Europeans. Braddock ignored him. As the column crossed the Monongahela River in July 1755, the forest erupted with gunfire. Invisible enemies shot from behind trees and rocks. Panic tore through the British ranks. Soldiers fell by the hundreds. Braddock was mortally wounded. Washington rode back and forth through the chaos, rallying survivors. His coat was pierced by bullets, but he was unharmed, a moment that would later feed the legend of his divine protection. The British defeat was devastating. The frontier was left exposed. French-led native war parties swept through Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, burning settlements and killing or capturing colonists. The British colonies were gripped by fear. The war that had started in the Ohio Valley was now consuming the entire frontier. From 1755 onward, the conflict spread like wildfire. The dense forests of North America became a deadly maze, filled with ambushes, raids, and skirmishes. British forts were besieged, villages destroyed, rivers ran red. To many colonists, it felt less like a European war and more like a nightmare, a return to the savage frontier. But behind the chaos, greater powers were at work. The war in America was just one front in a much larger struggle, the global 7 Years' War, which would soon involve every major power on earth, Britain, France, Spain, Austria, and Prussia. It was, in many ways, the First World War. For now, though, the fate of empires would be decided not in European capitals, but in the dark forests of America, where muskets cracked, drums echoed, and alliances hung by a thread. The first years of the French and Indian War were marked by disaster for the British. But change was coming. Across the ocean, new leaders would rise, men who saw that the struggle for North America was not just about fur, trade, or territory, but about empire itself. And at the heart of that struggle, a young colonial officer, George Washington, was learning lessons that would one day shape the birth of a nation. Part 2, The Tide Turns, The War for Empire. When the smoke of those early defeats cleared, one thing was obvious: the British Empire was not ready for war in the American wilderness. The proud redcoats who marched in straight lines on European battlefields found themselves lost, ambushed, and bleeding in forests where the enemy was invisible. For a time, it seemed that the French, with their native allies and their knowledge of the terrain, would dominate the continent. But empires are stubborn things. And soon, Britain would learn to fight not like Europe, but like America. In 1757, London was desperate. British armies were losing in Europe, the colonies were panicked, and France's influence stretched from Quebec to the Mississippi. Then came a new leader, William Pitt the Elder, a fiery statesman with one great conviction: America was the key to world power. Pitt poured money, men, and ships into the colonies. He promised the American assemblies that if they raised local troops, the crown would pay the cost. For the first time, the colonists felt like partners, not subjects, in the empire's greatest war. New generals were chosen, men who listened to colonial officers, who adapted to the land. Among them were Geoffrey Amherst, James Wolfe, and others who would soon change the course of history. The British war machine awakened, and the tide began to turn. By 1758, the war was raging across thousands of miles. From the icy waters of the Great Lakes to the warm swamps of the Mississippi, from the forests of Pennsylvania to the fortress walls of Quebec, soldiers, trappers, and native warriors fought in a continent-wide storm. British strategy now focused on cutting New France in half. Their goal was to seize the major forts guarding the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, to choke off French supply lines and isolate their strongholds. At the same time, the British Navy began to dominate the Atlantic. French reinforcements could no longer reach Canada safely. Across the colonies, the British were building ships, gathering militias, and coordinating like never before. The war that had once been scattered and chaotic was now unified under Pitt's command, and it was turning in Britain's favor. The first great success came in 1758 at Louisbourg, a massive fortress guarding the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. For years it had been called the Gibraltar of the North. Whoever held it controlled the gateway to Canada. British warships appeared off the coast of Cape Breton Island, carrying nearly 14,000 troops. The siege of Louisbourg lasted weeks. Cannon fire thundered day and night. French ships burned in the harbor, their walls crumbled under bombardment. Finally, the tricolour of France was lowered, and the British flag rose in its place. The victory electrified the colonies. It opened the St. Lawrence to British ships and set the stage for an assault on the heart of New France, Quebec itself. Yet even as the British triumphed in the north, the frontier bled. French and native war parties continued to raid settlements along the Pennsylvania and Virginia borders. Entire villages were burned, families slaughtered or taken captive. The frontier was a place of horror, where the war was personal and survival was uncertain. In the Ohio Valley, native alliances began to shift. The once powerful French presence was weakening, and tribes who had long sided with France began reconsidering. Some, seeing which way the wind was blowing, made new treaties with the British. Others, disillusioned by both empires, tried to remain neutral, but the war had grown too large to escape. The native nations were realizing a bitter truth: whichever European empire won, native independence would lose. Later in 1758, British and colonial forces, under General John Forbes, returned to finish what Washington had started 4 years earlier. Their target, Fort Duquesne, the French stronghold at the forks of the Ohio. This time, the British came prepared. They built a road across the mountains, cutting through the wilderness with thousands of men and wagons. The French, vastly outnumbered and short on supplies, could not hold out. As the British approached, they blew up the fort and retreated north. On the smoking ruins, the British built a new stronghold, Fort Pitt, named after the minister who had transformed their fortunes. Around it grew a small settlement, Pittsburgh. The frontier, once the site of Washington's humiliation, now belonged to Britain. Not every victory came easily. That same summer, a massive British army under General James Abercrombie marched against Fort Carillon, known later as Ticonderoga, on Lake Champlain. The French commander, Marquis de Montcalm, had only 3,600 men to Abercrombie's 15,000. But Montcalm, a brilliant strategist, ordered his men to build barricades of logs and sharpen stakes on the heights overlooking the fort. When the British attacked on July 8, 1758, they were cut down in waves. Musket fire shredded their lines. Nearly 2,000 British soldiers fell, one of the bloodiest defeats of the war. Montcalm became a hero of France. Yet his triumph was fleeting. The British would return. In 1759, the focus turned to the final goal, the capture of Quebec, the jewel of New France. The city sat on high cliffs overlooking the St. Lawrence River, its walls nearly impregnable. To reach it, the British had to fight both the elements and the enemy. Command was given to General James Wolfe, a young, determined officer known for his courage, and his frail health. He led a fleet of 200 ships and nearly 9,000 men up the river. Across the water stood Montcalm, with 14,000 defenders. For weeks the two armies faced each other, Wolfe bombarding the city, Montcalm refusing to fight a pitched battle. But Wolfe was patient, and daring. In September, under cover of night, he launched a bold plan. Using small boats, his troops silently climbed the steep cliffs at a place called the Plains of Abraham, just west of the city. When dawn broke, the French awoke to find the British army drawn up in battle formation, on their doorstep. September 13, 1759. The morning mist lifted over Quebec. The fate of a continent hung in the air. Montcalm, realizing the danger, rushed his men to confront Wolfe before reinforcements could arrive. The two armies faced each other across the field, just a few hundred yards apart. The French advanced first, firing hastily. The British held their line, silent, until the enemy was just 40 yards away. Then, in one thunderous volley, they fired. The French line broke. The battle lasted barely 15 minutes. Both commanders were mortally wounded. Wolfe was hit 3 times, collapsing as victory was announced. "Now, God be praised," he whispered, "I die in peace." Montcalm, carried from the field, murmured, "So much the better, I shall not live to see the surrender of Quebec." 5 days later, Quebec fell to the British. The following year, 1760, British forces marched into Montreal. With no hope of rescue, the French governor Vaudreuil surrendered. The French flag was lowered for the last time over Canada. After nearly a decade of war, New France was gone. The British now controlled everything east of the Mississippi River, except New Orleans. The great French Empire in North America had vanished, its forts, missions, and trading posts absorbed into Britain's growing dominion. But victory came at a cost. The British Empire was deep in debt. Tens of thousands were dead. Native nations were disillusioned and restless. And among the colonists, pride in their role in the victory began to turn into something more, a sense of independence. The French and Indian War didn't just reshape maps, it reshaped minds. The colonists had fought alongside British regulars, bled for the empire, and seen the incompetence of distant officials. They began to realize that they were capable of defending themselves, and perhaps, one day, governing themselves. Meanwhile, the British government, staggering under war debt, saw the colonies differently, as a resource to be taxed. The coming years would bring tension, protest, and revolution. But for now, in 1763, the drums of war fell silent. The Treaty of Paris ended the conflict. France ceded Canada to Britain, Spain received Louisiana, and the North American balance of power changed forever. The British Empire stood triumphant, but beneath the surface, the ground was already shifting. Part 3, The Aftermath and the Road to Revolution. The guns had finally fallen silent in 1763. The smoke that once drifted across the forests of North America cleared to reveal a new world, one reshaped by a decade of blood and fire. The British Empire now stretched farther than ever before. From the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, all of eastern North America was under the Union Jack. The once mighty French Empire had vanished, and Spain held only the lands west of the Mississippi. To the colonists, it looked like a golden age. To the native nations, it felt like the beginning of the end. And to Britain, exhausted, proud, and deeply in debt, it was time to collect the bill. The peace that followed the French and Indian War would prove to be as turbulent as the war itself. It would set the stage for rebellion, independence, and the birth of a new nation. The Treaty of Paris, signed in February 1763, officially ended the war. It redrew the map of North America. France ceded all of Canada and the territory east of the Mississippi to Britain. Spain, which had joined France late in the war, gave up Florida to Britain but received Louisiana in return. France kept only 2 tiny islands off Newfoundland, a faint memory of its once vast empire. The dream of a French America was dead. The British flag now flew over Montreal, Quebec, and the Great Lakes. The colonists rejoiced, their frontier was finally open. No more French forts, no more raids, no more fear. But their celebration was premature. While Europeans signed treaties across the ocean, in the forests of the Ohio Valley, native nations were far from finished fighting. The British, now ruling over former French territory, made a fatal mistake. They assumed the indigenous peoples would accept British rule as easily as the French had surrendered. But the British were different from the French, colder, stricter, less generous in trade, and often disrespectful of native diplomacy. The delicate balance the French had maintained was shattered. In the spring of 1763, a powerful Ottawa leader named Pontiac united a confederation of tribes, including the Ottawa, Potawatomi, Huron, Shawnee, Delaware, and others, to resist British occupation. Their goal, to drive out the British and restore the land to its rightful owners. They struck hard. In a matter of weeks, native warriors captured or destroyed nearly every British fort west of the Appalachians, from Michigan to western Pennsylvania. British settlers were killed or fled east in terror. The frontier burned once again. Pontiac's siege of Fort Detroit became legendary. British troops held out for months under constant attack. Rumors spread of British officers using smallpox-infected blankets to spread disease among native villages, one of the darkest episodes in colonial warfare. The rebellion shook the British Empire to its core. It revealed a truth London had ignored: conquering land was easier than ruling it. Desperate to end the violence, King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763. It drew an imaginary line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, forbidding colonial settlers from moving west into native territory. The idea was to prevent more bloodshed, to create a buffer zone between settlers and tribes. But to the colonists, it felt like betrayal. They had fought and died for that land. They had seen friends buried in the Ohio wilderness, had watched British banners rise over Fort Pitt and Fort Niagara. And now, after victory, the Crown was telling them, you cannot cross this line. Land-hungry colonists, especially veterans and frontier families, ignored the order. They moved west anyway, claiming farms and building cabins beyond the mountains. The seeds of rebellion were beginning to sprout. War is expensive, and the French and Indian War had nearly bankrupted Britain. The empire had spent over £130 million, an astronomical sum for the time. Maintaining thousands of soldiers in the colonies would cost even more. In London, Parliament faced a simple question: who should pay? The answer they gave would ignite the American Revolution. British officials argued that since the war had been fought to defend the colonists should share the cost. But in the colonies, people saw things differently. They had raised militias, lost family members, and fought bravely alongside British troops. Why should they now be taxed by a government 3,000 miles away, a government in which they had no representation? In the years following the war, Parliament introduced a series of taxes aimed at recouping the empire's losses: the Sugar Act, 1764, the Stamp Act, 1765, and the Townshend Acts, 1767. Each was met with outrage in the colonies. Pamphlets circulated. Protest meetings filled the town halls of Boston, Philadelphia, and Williamsburg. The colonists argued that Parliament had no right to tax them without their consent. No taxation without representation, became their rallying cry. The very unity that William Pitt had inspired during the war now turned against the empire he had built. The colonists, once proud to fight for Britain, began to see themselves as something different, not subjects, but Americans. The French and Indian War had done more than redraw borders. It had created a generation of men who understood war, strategy, and leadership. Among them was George Washington, now a seasoned veteran who had learned hard lessons about discipline, command, and the arrogance of British officers. He wasn't alone. Men like Thomas Gage, Horatio Gates, and Benedict Arnold, all future figures of the American Revolution, gained experience in this conflict. The war became their military classroom, teaching them how to fight an empire. And it taught the colonies something else, that when they worked together, New Englanders, Virginians, Pennsylvanians, they could accomplish great things. The seeds of national identity were sown in the mud of those battlefields. For France, the defeat was humiliating. But history has a sense of irony. A generation later, the same France that lost its American empire would help the American colonists defeat Britain in the Revolution, a revenge that would come full circle. For the native nations, the consequences were devastating. With France gone, there was no longer a counterbalance to British expansion. The once independent tribes faced increasing pressure, broken treaties, and forced displacement. The balance of power that had existed for centuries was gone forever. For Britain, victory brought pride, and paranoia. They ruled more land than ever, but they no longer trusted their colonists. They sent more soldiers, tightened trade laws, and demanded obedience. The empire grew stronger on paper, and weaker in spirit. For the American colonists, the war changed everything. It gave them confidence, a sense of shared destiny, and a deep resentment toward British arrogance. They had seen how distant rulers made foolish decisions that cost lives. They had watched British officers sneer at their militia, tax their goods, and dismiss their voices. Something inside the American soul began to shift. By the mid-1760s, only a few years after the Treaty of Paris, tension hung heavy across the colonies. British troops still patrolled their streets. Taxes rose. Laws tightened. Yet underneath the anger was a growing sense of unity, a quiet, powerful conviction that the colonists were no longer mere subjects of a faraway king. They had fought one war for empire. Soon, they would fight another for freedom. The French and Indian War, brutal, chaotic, and often forgotten, was more than just a colonial conflict. It was the crucible in which America was forged. The alliances, betrayals, and bloodshed of that decade shaped every idea that would soon define a nation: independence, liberty, and the right to determine one's own destiny. Long after the last cannon fired, the echoes of that war still haunted the land. Old battlefields grew over with grass. Forts turned to ruins. But the scars remained, in the memories of survivors, in the treaties broken, and in the restless energy of a continent about to change forever. From the Ohio Valley to the halls of London, from the wigwams of the Great Lakes to the taverns of Boston, the French and Indian War had left a mark that no peace treaty could erase. It had united 13 colonies in war. And would soon unite them again, in revolution. Less than 15 years after the guns of Quebec fell silent, those same colonies would rise against the very empire they had once fought to protect. Men who had served under British command now turned their weapons against it. The uniforms changed, but the lessons of the French and Indian War remained, lessons in courage, coordination, and the power of conviction. The war had begun as a struggle between kings. It ended as a prelude to democracy. And so, the French and Indian War stands as a turning point, the war before the Revolution, the fire that forged the American spirit. A story of ambition and arrogance, courage and tragedy, and of a young America learning, for the first time, what it meant to fight for its own destiny. The end. Like this video, subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next one.